Welcome, everybody, to another Ideas That Matter conversation. I'm very happy to have as my guest here today, Jack Visnjic, who has a lot of interesting background. And we're going to be talking about a number of different things, but in particular, this notion of anacyclosis. But Jack is somebody who I got to know in part through the most recent Stoicon, where he gave a really excellent presentation talking about Stoicism, duty, deontology, how we would parse that out. But he's not just a Stoicism guy. He's got a very wide background in ancient thought. Not, I was going to say ancient philosophy, but it's not just ancient philosophy. It's also drama, and you've done some archaeological stuff as well, right? So
Got my toes wet.
yeah. So I mean, I think that's kind of great because so many people are so narrowly specialized, and it seems like you have taken advantage of the opportunities put before you to get a pretty wide knowledge base. And you've also got a podcast about ancient thought. And so I actually, as we were kicking around, we were joking a little bit about how people answer questions. And you said something really, really funny that I wanted to start out with about people coming on to the Ancient Greece Declassified podcast, which we'll put a link to below, by the way, for those who are listening. So let's kick off with that.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks, Greg. As someone who has listened to hundreds of hours of your philosophy videos, as I was getting my PhD, it's an honor to be here. But yeah, this is something I'm sure you've encountered with guests who are used to talking to, say, journalists, and they have to get their talking points in, right? So yeah, my guests I'll ask them a question, like simple thing, like how many people could fit in the Athenian theater? Yeah. And they'll start by saying, well, before we get to that, we should first establish what a theater is, blah, blah, blah. And now to get to your question, the figure used to be this, but now scholarship is trending towards this number, although the correct answer might be more like this number. But the question you really should be asking is this, and blah, 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 blah. And I was saying, I'm not going to do that with you because you're not a journalist. You're a colleague and, a scholar. So I'm going to try to give you short answers so we can kind of bounce back and forth and get some nice dialogue going.
Yeah, I think that there's kind of two ends to that, right? There is the like, let's talk to journalists and we need to spoon feed them everything because oftentimes they don't do basic research. But you see a lot of that at academic conferences as well, not just the question that's not really a question, but actually a very long commentary. But even like the way that people answer questions, you ask them something and they're like, well, and there's all these different qualifications and points. And after a while, you're not quite sure whether the question got answered at all.
Yeah. I mean, some of that might be a defense mechanism because questions at academic conferences can be quite
hostile,
Yeah. Or at least it's like some people are looking for a weakness, in what you say.
There's a good bit of philonychia, the desire to win, to beat somebody else out. And actually so we're going to veer off course right away. I got interested in research on anger, and that's part of what got me into Stoicism. First, I was looking at Aristotle because he has so much to say about it back in graduate school. Mm-hmm. And I was interested in part the way a lot of people are when it comes to practical philosophy. I wanted to figure out why I was so screwed up and whether philosophy could help me out at all with it. But I was also struck by how prone to losing their temper with each other my fellow graduate students and then the professors were. And I was like, these are supposed to be rational people. I know I'm screwed up, but they're supposed to be like epitomes of rationality. And I think we could say something similar about that rivalrous, drive, whatever we want to call it. There are a lot of people in academia who are, they don't care about really anything else other than like beating out their peers. And I'm wondering, were you, so, we had different academic backgrounds. You're of a much, later generation than me. Do you think that's still the case?
Well, I was lucky that I perhaps didn't see that much of that. Although what I will say is, to me, if you want to see where like the real, like if you want to see where the bloodbath happens in academia, read the footnotes of an article.
Oh yeah.
That's where each scholar tells you who are his friends, who are his enemies. Like my colleagues at Berlin and Stanford all agree about this, but like these losers over in, Berkeley think that, and so like the footnotes is where the battle lines are drawn,
That's interesting. Yeah. Now, what is that? How does that get affected by the fact that now we're urged to use endnotes rather than footnotes, or in some cases we're even supposed to use like MLA and we don't get to do footnotes at all? Does that mean that you have to, like, I don't know, tamp down that rivalrous instinct? Or
Greg, if you've gotten to the point where your editors ask you to use endnotes, then you won, because you've like entered more of the public facing space.
Okay.
So you kind of you get to be a bit more of a free agent,
Yeah, that's true. It's interesting. So I don't mean to turn this into like a bitch session about, traditional academics, but I think that another thing we were talking about before this is, you were saying that some of your academic peers who have landed, tenure track jobs are a bit envious about the impact that your work, your thought has, because you reach a much wider public than they do, through particularly the podcast, but I'm imagining other things as well.
Yeah, well, they certainly don't envy my bank account, but they do envy the number of eager learners that my show reaches. And also I do tours in Greece where I take my listeners on adventures, and so it's I feel very lucky.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. A lot of times, I mean, I teach still, and you get students and you can get them interested in what you're talking about, but they don't initially come into the classes saying, "Oh man, this is exactly what I want. I can't wait to hear more about this." You have to do a bit of a sell over time about the usefulness or interest in the things that you're going to put before them. And sometimes you still lose them, halfway through the semester. Whereas with the podcast, if they're listening to it, it's precisely because they want to hear it, right? Nobody's making them. It's not part of a curriculum.
You still got to put the effort in, though. Like I like to start my episodes with a hook. Like the Persians have invaded Athens. It's burning to the ground. Where are the Athenians? And then you're like, oh, where are the Athenians, right? And then you kind of pull them in, and then you go into like all the details about what's happening. Whereas in your standard course, you can be like, well, in 480 BC this happened, and then in 479 BC this happened, and you're not gonna gain new students with that technique.
That's true. Yeah. So actually, that's a good segue into talking about something that I think a lot of people don't know much about. They probably are not even sure what the term means. So you have been affiliated as the director of research with the Anacyclosis Institute, and this is an interesting concept. What does that, for our viewers and listeners, what does that term actually mean?
Anacyclosis is an ancient theory about a grand cycle of political evolution or revolution, which theory posits that all archetypal forms of government, like democracy, tyranny, monarchy, etc., fall into a kind of standard sequence, and that or that any polity, any country or republic or body politic, if allowed to develop over time without being, without disasters, without being conquered, without being interfered with, will cycle through that large cycle. And the term itself, well, kyklos, most people recognize it's cycle, wheel, circle, and then the ana prefix is kind of like our prefix re, so like recycling, like the kind of the going around and round of the political archetypal forms.
So where does this kick off in Western philosophy? Because we have things like this in non-Western philosophy as well, right?
Yes. Well, I think every pre-modern society that I'm aware of, and that I'm aware of their view of history, they have cyclical views of history. Okay, like the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, the Chinese, the Indians. They all saw history as cyclical, and we in the modern West almost unanimously see history as kind of moving forward, so linear. And so it's a kind of strange idea to us, but I think that is the standard picture you get in pre-modern times. Okay, so I think even in Homer's time, you find echoes of a cyclical view. Like, Homer talks about the generations of men being like the leaves falling from a tree, right? Well, that's a cyclical, seasonal process, right? But then the closest thing to the first time we see something that's recognizably anacyclosis is in Plato's Republic, chapters, or really like books, but really chapters 8 and 9, where he talks about a sequence of 5 forms of government in a predetermined order, a natural order. And then a few hundred years later, the term itself, anacyclosis, and the fully fledged theory appears in the historian Polybius, who was writing in around like 130 BC or so in Rome. He's a Greek hostage in Rome. He is amazed at Rome's unexpected rise to world dominance, and he's trying to understand how that happens, and he writes his histories to explain that. And in book 6, he has a kind of digression about constitutions, because he thinks that the answer to why Rome took over the world is its constitution. And getting into that theory, he explains anacyclosis. So that's where we get the full thing articulated. Unfortunately, he only summarizes it briefly, because he says, my readers, like anybody who is smart and has looked at history, will know that this is true. He says others have already written about this at great length. We don't have those other authors. Most ancient writings don't survive. So we're lucky to have a portion of his writings. And he gives a short summary of what he claims is widely discussed and widely acknowledged. And that's all we get.
So you don't think that there are many people in the present who have or express views along those lines? I mean, you see these memes floating around with that. I forget exactly how it's expressed, but it's about weak and strong men and hard times and good times. That seems to be sort of a dumbed down version of this, isn't it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the meme has not become extinct, of course, and even among, like there was, I think the guy's name is Neil Howe. There were a couple authors that wrote a book on generations, in American history, and this is where you might have heard like this idea of like the third turning and the fourth turning.
Oh, right, yeah.
Right. So that comes from a book written in the 90s, I believe, by 2 people. They were not, I don't think they were academics, historians, but they looked at the generations of Americans since, the 1700s, and they thought that there was like a pattern of taking each generation to be 20 years. I think they came up with 4 or maybe even 8 archetypes of different generations. And this book impressed Al Gore so much that he gave like free copies to every member of Congress. Okay. So that's one type of cyclical theory, right?
Yeah.
You also have, and there are such theories. Okay. You also have, Peter Turchin, who has coined the term Cleodynamics. Cleo being the Greek muse of history. So he uses this term to describe like the science of modeling history, and he goes out of his way to not use the word cyclical because it has such a bad association in the present academic context. But he has models of how things recur over time. But all of these things, none of these models I'm aware of has like, they all kind of have a boom to bust cycle, rise and fall cycle.
Right.
They don't go through different archetypes of constitutional structure. What sets anacyclosis apart is that it has, within it has 3 rise and fall cycles, but all 3 of those are arced over a larger evolution of political form. So the first rise and fall cycle is monarchy, tyranny. The second, then you have a phase shift from one man rule to a few people ruling, and then you have a rise and fall cycle or arc in from aristocracy to oligarchy. Then you have a phase transition to democracy, and then you have a rise and fall mini cycle, epicycle to use your term, from democracy to ochlocracy, which means mob rule.
Right. Okay.
Right? So that is quite unique in history, I think.
I mean, do we see something? Aristotle doesn't have a cyclical dynamic. He talks in ways more like, well, you can move to this or you can move to this. And by the way, all the Greek city states are all screwed up anyway. I mean, he doesn't think that there's any ideal at any single point in time. But I mean, it does sound like the building blocks are there in terms of, one person rule, but in terms of the common good, one person rule to help themselves out or their group or their cronies. And then, similarly for aristocracy, oligarchy, and then, good democracy, what he calls, the constitutional government versus the rule of the crowd, which he just calls democracy.
Yes.
So are they, the people who are theorizing about this? I mean, obviously Plato has discussed these regimes as well, as you pointed out in the Republic, but is Aristotle lurking in the background and his concerns about, who's ruling for the sake of whom?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many issues you just brought up. Okay. I should just clarify for our listeners, okay, that the trend in the academic fashion or trend in the past 50 years in academic history has been to basically deny any cyclical patterns in history whatsoever. Okay.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, when scholars talk about Plato or Polybius, they kind of just dismiss it as if, well, of course it's just dumb, right? They don't go to the trouble of debunking it thoroughly. Okay.
Yeah.
So, there was
is part of that the sort of, well, what could these ancient people know about modern society?
I think so.
Knee-jerk response.
Part of it. I mean, I think, okay, what the psychological motivations of other people are is always a tricky thing to get to, right? Yeah. But I think in many ways, like the first millennium BC is so similar to our moment that to actually take it seriously would be terrifying. We like to think that we're still caught in. Well, I say caught. We still find ourselves in a view of history that's taking us to the promised land, right?
Okay.
And there was an article maybe 5 years ago in one of these big publications like National Geographic or Scientific American. Somebody did like a big data analysis on the life cycle of civilizations and basically said, like, based on history, America probably has 100 or 200 years left at most. Okay. And somebody posted this on like the biggest Facebook group of classicists, which I was a member of.
Okay.
And the response was just entirely negative. Like people just, it seemed like they were even angry at this, like, come on, this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
And it's like, if we're gonna, like, what are we gonna be? Are we an eternal civilization? Are we not subject to the same phenomena that caused rise and fall to happen to every other civilization in the past? Like, so I think that people don't want to accept that we might not be making progress indefinitely. That's one thing.
Yeah, I mean, I do see quite a few people out there who are pessimistic, but that's just sort of another, well, it's all going to crap, not that something will come out of this
Yeah.
that will be a qualitatively different way of living together, using power, making decisions, right?
Yeah, I mean, okay, but and we can return to that to the modern view, but I want to actually try to
Okay,
answer
go
your
ahead.
question. Okay,
Yeah.
so um, when so in the 2016 election, in the run up to the election, this journalist named Sullivan wrote an article called "America Has Never Been So Ripe for Tyranny," where he used Plato's Republic to explain what was happening at the time, and he basically said that we got rough times ahead. And then I actually have an episode about this. I analyzed the reaction to this because this journalist, I think his name was Jeff Guo, and he did a very good job as a journalist. Like he actually found the few classicists who do believe in patterns, which is
Okay.
very very impressive. Like I'll give him credit for that. And he asked them about this, Sullivan's article, and they all said, "Well, it's a good effort, but his fatal flaw was that he took Plato seriously."
Oh,
Like Plato was
okay.
not a historian. He was not empirical. He was an idealist philosopher. He sat in his armchair and he looked with his mind's eye to the forms. Okay.
Well, there is that aspect. That's quite true, but that seems kind of a strange thing for them to be saying. I mean, he hung out with Dionysus, trying to see if maybe some of these
Yeah.
ideas could be put into practice. Figured out, nope. Made some other efforts. So, what do you make of that?
Well, I totally disagree, and I have an episode about this.
Okay.
And I think Plato was actually an empirical thinker. I think the term idealist is completely misused to describe him. Like,
Okay.
yes, he is an idealist in the sense that he believes non-material entities are very real, but he's not an idealist in the sense that, oh, we could all be living under rainbows with unicorns flying around. That's not the kind of idealist he is. I think he is an empirical thinker who's also an idealist in the philosophical sense.
Yeah.
Now, we don't have to agree on that, but the way that if you press modern scholars, because they don't really think it's worth getting into this, but if you press them, they'll dismiss Anacyclosis by saying Plato was an idealist, Xenophon and Aristotle have totally different views, and Polybius, his writing is too abbreviated and short, and it's too focused on Rome to really be taken as being based on a large empirical study.
Okay.
And my answer to that is, I don't think there's actually that much of a difference between Aristotle, Xenophon, and Plato. It looks like they're writing very different things because they use different terms. Okay. So, for example, Aristotle calls the bad form of popular government democracy.
Right.
Polybius calls the good form of popular government democracy.
Yeah.
But so that you could look at that and say, oh, they're totally at variance. But the key point is they both agree that there is a good form and a bad form. Who cares what labels they use? They both agree on the substance, which is that there's a good form and a bad form of popular government, and that there's a good form and a bad form of limited, government by a few, and that there's a good form and a bad form of one man rule. So they are more in agreement than they're in disagreement. The one thing where Aristotle is at variance is the sequence of evolution, and he has, I think at the end of, I think this is what you were talking about, at the end of book 5, I think, of the Politics, he says, well, an oligarchy can be a democracy, and a democracy can become an oligarchy, and an aristocracy can become, like, he kind of he sees examples of all kinds of transitions that don't obey the large cycle.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could say that he doesn't see a single cycle in it, but that it's almost like a web that you can go from one node to another, but you can't like go from any single one form into any other form, right? There's some, what would you call it, confinement to it. And you could think of like a cycle as being more confined, but there's still, it seems, some wiggle room, right? If you knew that, for example, let's say there is one big cycle and you know what it is and you are actually in charge, so you can make some decisions that change things. You could try to slow it down, right? Hold it back, although inevitably you're going to wind up in the next stage. Or you could maybe make the landing a bit more cushioned, perhaps.
Well, I think Aristotle doesn't agree that there is a next stage. So, he...
Right.
And I think that there are two ways that Plato and Polybius... So Plato and Polybius are very much aligned. Polybius even claims that that a lot of the things he is omitting for the sake of brevity are found in Plato. Okay, so they're kind of... Plato has not yet arrived at the full classification of polity, so he hasn't yet divided democracy into a good form and bad form.
Okay, yeah.
That's an innovation that Aristotle perhaps either did himself or was part of the generation that did.
Yeah.
And that kind of improved the model, I think. But anyway, Plato and Polybius, I think, if they saw Aristotle's counter argument, they would have two ways to reply, at least. One is to say, we're not talking about a fixed sequence, we're talking about a statistical sequence.
Okay.
Yes, of course, a democracy could become an oligarchy, but statistically, it's more inclined to become whatever, right?
Yeah.
The second way they could apply to Aristotle is to say, well, you can't treat every single polity as statistically of equal statistical weight. For example, if a large independent sovereign polity like Athens or Rome undergoes a certain change, that has much more statistical weight than if some tiny polis that's being pushed around by its neighbors undergoes a thing, right? So because if you have bullying neighbors, any change is possible. You can turn any state into anything. You can turn a monarchy into democracy overnight. You can turn a democracy into a tyranny overnight. So this cycle is really about sovereign states, like independent states that are allowed to develop without too much, without being buffeted too much by external forces.
So in our current day, where we have a much more connected international system, particularly an economic system, but also in terms of military alliances and all sorts of agreements that we've made with each other, does that make it more difficult to apply these theories to the present? I mean, can we talk about the USA, which is the hyperpower, as something that would be subject to these, or are we still getting interfered with, pushed around, not so much bullied? I mean, who bullies the United States? But we do more of the bullying. Could it work for?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that in the past millennium, even, the two states that arguably show anacyclosis in the greatest detail are Britain and America, which have been very powerful and and uniquely protected by sea from like everybody else. Right?
Yeah.
Britain enjoyed more security than any other European nation because of the English Channel. And then America has two oceans protecting it. And arguably Britain and America have gone through all the stages so far, except the last one if you're optimistic, but including the last one if you're pessimistic.
Okay.
Which is mob rule.
Yeah. What about other countries, I mean, you think about the grand sweep of world history, and two of the countries slash civilizations that have been, in general, driving forces have been India and China. Do we see them going through this sort of cycle? I mean, certainly we have, dynasties arising, and the notion of, like, the mandate of heaven, losing it, gaining it, stuff like that. But do we see something like a full cycle happening?
Okay, this is a tricky question. So
Okay.
in this case, I do need to offer a prelude. Okay, so democracy does not exist throughout history.
Right.
Okay. And there are certain periods where you see like clusters of democracies forming. And in the model that we developed at the Anacyclosis Institute, we see kind of three big waves of democracy. Or really, let's just call it non-monarchical government.
Participatory government,
Participatory
right?
government,
Yeah,
constitutional government. Okay.
Okay.
The first big wave was in the first millennium BC in the Mediterranean, and it wasn't just Greek states; it was Greek, Italic, and Etruscan, and Phoenician city-states. Like Carthage was a republic. Was a republic. There were Etruscan republics. There were Latin republics. So that's the first big wave, and probably the biggest wave in terms of numbers. There were well over 1,000 non-monarchical states at that time, which is why I think the ancient theory of anacyclosis is the best theory we have, because they had a bigger data set than we have.
Okay.
The second wave is in Italy in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance. We have all these city-states like Florence and Venice and Genoa, right? These are also republics, non-monarchical constitutional states. And then the third wave is the one we're living in, the one that started on the North Atlantic seaboard and now has spread to much of the world. And so we're living in the third cluster or wave or constellation of democracies that we know about in history. And we might not be halfway through it yet. So we are very optimistic about the future, because we've never seen a powerful democracy fall by its own devices in the modern era.
Without being invaded or something like that, right? Is what you're including there? Okay. Yes. Yeah.
So we have yet to see, a state like the UK or America fall apart because of factional division and, coup d'etats and stuff like that. Okay.
Right. Okay. So yeah, nothing like Aristotelian stasis happening.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yes. Okay.
You could argue that we're seeing it now for the first time.
Yeah.
You could argue that we had a preview of it in the 60s, but we haven't seen like civil wars where neighbors are killing neighbors. Like what you get in over 100 years of the late Roman Republic. You have people killing their neighbors again and again.
Right.
Like between 130 and 30 BC, right? You have like 2 civil wars, you have 3 slave revolts, you have the social war. Like,
yeah,
Italy is a bloodbath more than it's peaceful during that entire century of the Republic, right?
Yeah.
So we haven't seen anything like that. And so we think democracies are the most stable. We got a bright future. And now to get back to China and India, okay? Why is it? So I think the anacyclosis model was the product of thinkers living in one of those constellations or clusters of democracy.
Okay.
And I think it's really in those clusters of democracies that you see the full cycle. And the question is then, why don't you see it in large land empires like China and India? Okay. And I think the reason is that large land empires are not able to maintain economic growth for the same amount of time as these relatively small, rich, often maritime, enterprising, commercial countries that become democracies. So so if you look at the city-states of the ancient world or the Italian states of the Renaissance or the first democracies in the modern time, they were all relatively small compared to the larger empires of the day, but in terms of per capita wealth, they were way more wealthy. So when you have like a network of smaller commercial, enterprising, maritime states, they can kind of rise above the economic limitations of the larger land empires around, and they can become extremely wealthy at a per capita level.
Okay.
And they can maintain economic growth for a longer time, and then they can go through all the cycles. Now, China, I think, is actually gone pretty far in the cycle. So China was oscillating back and forth between monarchy and tyranny for most of its history. I would argue that after the communist takeover, Mao was a classical tyrant.
Right.
I would argue later that China transitioned into an aristocracy in the ancient sense of the word, not in the modern sense. Okay.
Yeah.
And I would argue that China is now, in the classical sense, an oligarchy.
Right. I would say that's right. Yeah.
So according to Anacyclosis, it could phase transition to democracy. That's possible. It could also backtrack. So the Anacyclosis model also allows you to go back a level. Like the key point is you can't jump across the wheel. You can go forward one or go back one.
Okay. Well, that's a really important point to make, because I think a lot of people, when they hear about cyclical models, they it is like that meme where you're here, you got to go here. There's only one arrow, and then you're going to go here next. And okay.
Yeah. So, we could see China go back to a more tyrannical or monarchical system. We could see it go forward. And the question then is, well, what could propel it forward? And I think, again, based on our research at the Institute, you would need economic growth. So it would have to grow even more than it's grown to this point, which is it's getting difficult. Like China has done so well.
Yeah.
It's hard to see it continuing at that pace, but it's possible. And the other thing is there has to be external pressure, which kind of scares the elites into distributing wealth more among the people.
So external rather than internal pressure of the people agitating and saying, you better share the wealth with us or we're going to overthrow you or something like that. I mean, that can be helpful, but you're saying that fear of having to deal with a external rival enemy is more efficacious in getting them to share power and economic opportunity.
I mean, internal instability and fighting can result in wealth redistribution, although more often than not, it does not. More often than not, internal civil wars and
just destroys wealth, right?
Exactly, and actually leads to, like, think of the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic. In the Roman Republic, the last 100 years of its history, every civil war resulted in fewer and fewer families having all the wealth, until you got to the point where like 3 men had enough power to control the entire republic. The first triumvirate.
Yeah.
So there's nothing like external pressure. I mean, think of the GI Bill in the Second World War, right?
Okay.
Think of the same thing happened to Athens. When Athens was attacked by the Persians, the Areopagus, which was like the elite council of the richest citizens, they paid the average Athenian Joe money to get on those ships and pull those oars, right? It was like the first GI. It was like the first GI Bill, and it created the voting base of the Athenian democracy, right? So, and like Walter Scheidel, who's at Stanford, has talked about this. Like, there's very few things in history that can lead to the elites pushing wealth back down into the middle class, and one of them is mass mobilization, which only happens when the elites are scared of some enemy, basically.
Right. So how would that, coming back to China, how would that work on the part of current day China? I mean, they have a great rival in India, but it seems that China's got the edge on them. Russia is basically falling apart, no longer really even a rival. It's a question of whether some Chinese regime might not take out the opportunity to take back some land. they view us as a huge rival, but it seems like, things are fairly stable in terms of our alliance systems and the fact that we're buying so much from them. What could be a significant external threat to them? Is there anything that you can think of? Or
yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a big part of the answer is yes, we are the United States. I mean, like we have people like Graham Allison at Harvard who write books about the Thucydides trap, right? Are the U.S. and China locked on an inevitable course towards war? And President Xi of China has actually read, I think he's read that book, and he's mentioned the Thucydides trap, this idea that when you have two rivals for the number one spot, right, it's historically very difficult to avoid war. So China sees, maybe they see the US or maybe they see the collective West as their main rival. What's really key is how do the elites in China deal with this, right?
Okay.
So let me illustrate two paths for you. Okay. Path number one: China continues to experience incredible economic growth. Okay. The number of rich businessmen increases. Therefore, in all those rich business people, they have families and they all want elite spots. This is what Peter Turchin calls elite overproduction. You get more and more people that want to be elites.
Yeah.
Okay. But the number of spots is fixed. You can't just keep making more movie stars.
Right.
So then there's increasing competition, and this would lead to stasis unless certain things can prevent that. Stasis being, factional strife, right?
Right.
So
yeah.
One way that so you're gonna, based on history, based on Anacyclosis, you're gonna get two factions that emerge, and each one is gonna try to build a a base of support, and each one is gonna start going further and further down the economic ladder, trying to get more and more support.
Recruit support, right? Yeah.
You can see this in the Roman way of voting. Like the Romans counted votes starting from the top, like the wealthiest citizens, and they only continued counting if the results were not very clear. Like if there was a tie, they would count to the poorer and poorer citizen votes. But if it was like a clear winner among the richer voters, they would just stop right there. Like the poor are irrelevant to the factional struggle unless they're needed because there's a tie further up. Okay. So
yeah.
If there's not enough economic growth to satisfy the increasing number of elite aspirants, they might start, some conflict, some mob violence. There might be instability, which might cause the state to collapse and revert to some kind of, more concentrated form of government, like a tyranny, like Mao's time. Okay. But if there's economic growth and China is able to enter markets in Africa and in the Middle East and in the Pacific and in South America, and they need more and more enterprising imperialists to go out there and establish these markets and maybe fight a local war, or maybe fund a local guerrilla force to oust some other former colonial power, right? Like if they need more and more people to go out and do this imperialism, they might then that might create the need to make a more widely distributed deliberative body that has real power, and then you're getting to like a republic or even a proto-democracy.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, this process that you're describing is, in its conception, a political one. but it has all these other dimensions, economics, the wider culture. Do we see cyclical things like this within other areas of a culture or civilization, or is it that the political essentially is driving all of this?
Well, I suspect yes, but now you're getting to, I mean, there's only so much a single human brain can grasp, right? So I don't pretend to have arrived at the level of understanding where I can actually look at cultural and economic and political trends. I mean, I suspect that they do. There
Go
are
through
feedback,
cycles
there are
of
feedback loops with all those things, right? Like the Athenian cultural renaissance happened after Athens became powerful and rich, right? So there's definitely a strong correlation there, but that's kind of beyond the scope of what we've been researching.
Okay. One of the questions that I had for you is, and I'm going to actually bring two questions together. So, there's different, let's call them rival cycles that you could point to where they're not exactly the same, but they share some common ground. But we also have different conceptions of, I would say, wider range of conceptions of, say, democracy than in ancient times. You think about, for example, Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America, distinguishing between what at that time he was thinking of as European democracy and then American democracy on the basis of participation and whether you have these intermediate institutions. And I would say, by the way, that almost everything that de Tocqueville said back then doesn't apply to contemporary America anymore. There's a lot of people who want to say, oh yeah, we just got to get back to this and everything will be hunky dory. But I don't see that as a possibility. But what we can say is that there's maybe a wider range of conceptions of political regimes because our societies have become more complex. So if that's the case, can these older models, I mean, we could say, well, we just expand the older model, right? Or there's alternate paths within it. Is it as adaptable to late modern times?
Well, two quick points. First, America in the time of Tocqueville is not a democracy under the Anacyclosis model.
Okay.
It's an aristocracy at that time.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So
what de Tocqueville is talking about is how an aristocracy effectively develops using its, let's call them from the ground up, how you incorporate people who can, I mean, that makes sense because what he's talking about in part is similar to how Aristotle talks about how you develop the capacity to rule yourself and rule others.
Yeah. No, for sure. And I think actually this is something I should have mentioned earlier for our listeners' sake, because there's a lot of terms that we use in history that do not map onto the Anacyclosis. So let's just clarify that for a second. Okay. First of all, when America revolted against Great Britain was not a monarchy under the Anacyclosis model. Okay. It had a monarch, a ceremonial figurehead, but Britain at the time was probably an oligarchy or an aristocracy. I mean, so the British Reform Act of, what was it, 1680 something, that where the Parliament becomes basically the ruling body of Great Britain.
Right.
In classical terms, that means it's no longer a monarchy. Even though it's called now the United Kingdom, it's not a kingdom at all under the classical rubric. It's like Sparta. Sparta had kings, but they were not actually kings.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Britain was an aristocracy, probably becoming an oligarchy, and the Americans didn't like that, so they revolted and they established an aristocracy in the ancient sense, which meant, like something like 10% or less than 15% people actually could vote at the time of the independence. Like the number of Americans that could actually vote in 1800 was, I'm pretty sure, less than 15%. Okay, so it was not a democracy, and none of the founders claimed it was a democracy, and none of the founders wanted it to be a democracy. They all explicitly wanted it to be a republic, in the Polybian sense of that, a mix of democracy and aristocracy and kingship. They wanted to have elements of the three archetypes in order to prevent anacyclosis. They believed, as Polybius had argued, that if they have, the bicameral Congress, which is the democratic element, and the Supreme Court, which is the aristocratic element, and the presidency, which is the monarchic element, that they can have a hybrid that will be immune to anacyclosis, to the evolution or revolution of polities. Okay, so America early on is an aristocracy. In the Gilded Age, late 1800s, where you have the like super rich,
right,
like the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and everything, then that's an oligarchy. Then after World War II, when you have the greatest middle class in the history of the world, that's arguably its democratic, the birth of American democracy in the classical sense. And now we are either in or approaching ochlocracy or mob rule, or the rule of demagogues. So just to clarify how American history would look under the Anacyclosis model.
Okay. Now, I mean, a lot of people in contemporary America would claim that we're really much more, we've reverted back to an oligarchy, and people talk about this as being a new Gilded Age. I'm guessing that you would say, no, they're wrong about that.
Well, I think they're right. I think that we can use better words.
Okay.
So one of the beauties of ancient Greco-Roman political thought is the rich vocabulary, and I think we are fools today to not make use of that. Okay, because those words were the result of centuries of philosophical debates. They didn't just have these words. They fought hard. They fought hard to come up with these words, right? So, yes, a late stage democracy under Anacyclosis, an ochlocracy or mobocracy, is an oligarchy in the sense that the wealth is concentrated in a super elite. Okay, but since we already use the term oligarchy to describe an earlier stage of anacyclosis, I think I think we can use another term like plutocracy.
Okay.
Which in the dictionary might look the same, but let's call a late stage democracy that looks like an oligarchy a plutocracy, and let's call a late stage aristocracy an oligarchy, and then in that way we can have a much more differentiated vocabulary, and we can make distinctions that might be very useful in how we look at the history of a society. So yes, we do have the same amount of inequality today in America as we did in like 1890, but many things have changed. And so I would rather use a different word. I would say that was an oligarchy in the classical sense, and now we can talk about a plutocracy, a late stage democracy, a mobocracy, or an ochlocracy, because like civilizations have a memory. And when you have experienced democracy, which Americans of the 1890s had not, you have a different consciousness. Like, you know what it was like to have a voice and to have a say.
Now that raises another question that I wanted to ask you about, and I'm going to use Rousseau as sort of like a example here. So Rousseau in Discourse on the Origins of Inequality, he's got this like going from savagery to barbarism to civilization. And of course, these are really, really big picture things. And then once we've got civilization, the four main differentiators between people that he talks about in that essay are virtue, which, at first we give people power because they're good. We recognize that. We're like, yeah, this guy's looking out for us. And then very quickly it winds up being about wealth and power and social status, and those wind up being sort of the big deciders and dividers. And Rousseau has, he's got a kind of a cyclical thing, right? You have some sort of social contract. He's, I don't think we have to buy into his notion of the social contract per se, but there's some sort of agreement on how things ought to be in society. And things get out of whack, and eventually people are like, well, this is BS. Get rid of these people, and that's great from Rousseau's perspective, except for the fact that because you've been civilized so long, he's pessimistic about this. You become enervated, as he calls it, meaning that you never get back to the beginning point anymore. So, what you're talking about, if you've got experience of a functional democracy, it's very different, when that's looming in the background than if you've never had that before. I mean, you think about like when we went into Iraq and we're like, yeah, we're going to make a democracy here. It's all going to work out nice. Bush had that whole democracy agenda, very broad projects. And funny enough, it didn't work because, they had experience to some degree with some amount of participatory government, but nothing within several generations. And so when you've got these things, how did you put it? The memory.
Yeah, civilizations have a memory.
Okay, civilizations have a memory. Yeah. And that memory could be, traumatizing, or it could be idealistic, or it could be all sorts of things. Does that affect the cycle so that you're not dealing with the same raw material as you would be in a different polity?
Yeah, I think so. So this is like our predicament today and that of the Romans in the late Republic is you have this. Large segmented population, which is former middle class, maybe still thinks it's middle class, but isn't really, because okay, so what's the middle class? It's people who are financially independent and have extra leisure time to devote to public affairs, right? Like you can go and vote, you can take a day off and go vote, and your kids are not gonna go hungry.
Yeah.
Right. Aristotle said, I think very astutely, that the size of the middle class has to be bigger than the rest of the population. Like the very poor and the very rich together have to be in the minority. The middle class has to be bigger than that if you're going to have a democracy or a republic.
Yeah.
We are now approaching a shrinking middle class, and we have a lot of people who are actually too poor to really be middle class, many of whhom are told that they're middle class, but Aristotle would say, no, you're not. You cannot take a day off to go vote because you will go hungry. You already owe, your rent. If you owe rent, if you have credit card debt, you're not middle class according to the classical theorists, right?
Yeah.
So like with the late Roman Republic, we too have a dwindling middle class, but we don't want to let go of that. And we all remember what it was like when this was a middle class run system.
Yeah.
But things are getting worse for us economically, and we have these demagogues who are promising to make things better for us. Right. Making us divide each other into sides, into factions, and they each claim that the other side is the one that's like making everything worse. The economy sucks because of that person. I'm gonna, restore XYZ. And unfortunately, historically, those promises are very rarely kept.
Yeah.
But the fact that people have that memory, I think, is what makes a late stage democracy very different from a late stage aristocracy, and why I wouldn't use oligarchy. Dude,
okay.
I would just use another synonym like plutocracy to describe what we have.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go on too much of a tangent, but you see a lot of people really since 2016 throwing around the term was it
Kakistocracy?
Yeah, there we go. It's a difficult one to pronounce. I mean, do you think that actually has any real legs to it for describing the weird patronage situation? I mean, it's not as if the Democrats don't engage in a lot of weird patronage with people who shouldn't be getting positions, getting them for making donations or stuff like that. But it seems like at least the MAGA/Trump Republican Party is doing that on steroids, where we look at the appointments and we're like, how the hell is this person remotely qualified to be in charge of this or that, right? So does that term, is that an applicable term, or should we just say that's basically like a slur that people use for regimes they don't like?
Well, I think that term is designed to be insulting.
Yes.
Right. And so is there a lot of truth in it? Yes, but I think if we're trying to be analytical and critical and dispassionate in our thinking, like, we can all laugh at that term and I even use it. But if we want to have like an accurate discussion, I think there are other terms, like, again, elite overproduction, right? There are too many elite aspirants in our society that want too few spots, and as a result, people resort to very immoral and vicious tactics to get those spots. It's like musical chairs, but you're allowed to punch people and push them over, before they sit down in the chair.
Yeah.
Right? Like this. How much time do we have, by the way, just to know?
Probably another 15 minutes, I'd say.
Okay. So let me introduce another insight from Walter Scheidel at Stanford, who, by the way, for the record, is not, as far as I know, an anacyclosis aficionado, but his book, The Great Leveler, it was very useful to us at the Institute because he looks at inequality over thousands of years of history. Okay. And his grand thesis is that under normal circumstances, inequality is always increasing. Look at any society in history at any point.
Until you reach a breaking point, because it's not as if you could actually.
Well, hold on. So, so for most of the time, every society has, it's like cranking the inequality up. Okay. And then there are only 4 types of shocks that push it back down, according to him. One is like plague and catastrophe. Okay. One is mass mobilization warfare. One is, or maybe plague, mass mobilization warfare, catastrophes, and I think maybe revolutions. Okay, I don't remember all 4 right now. But the key insight is that day to day, if a civilization is not being battered or in a crisis or being shaken up, the inequality is percolating upwards. It's the opposite of trickle down economics. It's trickle up economics. Okay, so this explains the 3 mini cycles in anacyclosis. Like, what makes a tyranny worse than a kingship? What makes an oligarchy worse than aristocracy? What makes an ochlocracy worse than a democracy? It's because, so you have this phase transition that establishes a new archetype, whether it's kingship, whether it's aristocracy, whether it's democracy. So often by a crisis, often that crisis results in people coming together, they work together, and suddenly, and oftentimes there's a military victory or something has been overcome. People feel a high boost of morale, like, we can do this, we can be together, like new future, new paradigm, better than before. People feel great. But then things go back to normal, and then you have the perkle up, the perkle up economics, the Walter Scheidel effect. Inequality is slowly increasing, slowly increasing, slowly increasing. There's more and more elite aspirants that want those elite spots. That becomes factionalism. And then you get to a point, a late stage aristocracy or kingship or democracy, where things have become much more unequal. You have a wealth at the top among a viciously, a severely divided elite that are at each other's throats over those spots. They try to use popular support to batter their enemies, and they use demagogic promises to get that support. And the most unscrupulous of them succeed in winning the game of musical chairs. And, so that's the process that takes each good form of government to the bad form of government.
Yeah. I was thinking as you were talking about that, about the rhetoric that we see from people who aren't necessarily in the tech industry, but let's call them tech adjacent, where, really since, say, the 90s, there's been all this, we're going to have a new system, and we're going to create all sorts of opportunities for people, and it's just going to be great, man. We'll have, pick whatever new trend you like. Social media is going to help us out, or incorporate it, or the gig economy is going to be the way to go, and none of this ever turns out to be remotely a equalizer. We just see more and more of what you were talking about, of wealth trickling upward in that. So I think a lot of, at least I know I've certainly become much more cynical when I hear somebody in tech talking about this is going to change everything and change it for the better, whether it's about offices or education or, selling cars or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, look, I live in Seattle. Okay, I live in the second technopolis of America.
Yeah,
okay? I'm surrounded by tech people, and their optimism is both charming and, I find, historically delusional. Because tech has created a concentration of wealth that allows this small bubble on the West Coast to experience a certain kind of progress. But people in Oklahoma don't feel that. In fact, their jobs are being made redundant by new tech innovations.
Right.
So,
well, and it pervades their life too. I mean, they've all got mobile phones. They are exposed to, all the things that can extract wealth from them. I was just, reading today about something that I have particularly strong opinions on, probably stronger than I ought to, namely sports betting, and the fact that we subject, now, we just open the doors to it. And you can see how easy it is to just lose tons and tons of money and place yourself in great debt. And I even have family members who made bad business decisions, thought they would get themselves out of it by doing a little sports betting because they thought they were going to beat the house, and wound up with double or triple the debt that they originally had. And so the person in Oklahoma or anywhere else, I mean, even if they're in Seattle and they're not in that tech bubble, they are experiencing the effects of this permeation of the internet into all of our lives. But they don't usually look at that and say well, let's get rid of it altogether, which that's good, at least. We don't want a neo-Luddite movement happening. But so coming back to this, you've talked, and at the very beginning, you talked about philosophers and whether they were engaged in empirical research. Aristotle clearly was, right? And you were making the case, and I think you're right, that Plato was as well, that he's not an idealist in the sense of, oh, you just find the patterns and now everything makes sense. He was actually looking at real things. And I'm wondering, so when we're talking about historical models like this, You can talk about doing a lot of inductive empirical research, and that's great. But do we need to do that? I mean, we could talk about these as like inferences to the best explanation or abductive hypotheses that help to make sense out of what it is that we're observing, and then that kind of lowers the bar. So if we don't if we haven't studied 100 civilizations in considerable depth and done all this statistical work, we could still be right about things, right? Or do you think there's a value to having done all that inductive work?
Well, I'm a strong believer that theorists who don't have any way to do experiment or do empirical research are indistinguishable from priests.
Okay.
Like you need to have an empirical basis. And the great tragedy of anacyclosis is that we have lost all of the data, or not all. We have lost 90% of the data that Plato and Polybius had access to when they came up with these theories.
Right.
Like Aristotle sent out his grad students, as they call them, right,
yeah,
to collect 156 studies of 156 republics. Okay, we only have one of those.
I know. Yeah.
And we only have it because it was discovered by some miracle in Egypt 150 years ago in the sand.
Yeah.
So imagine if we had 156 descriptions of like Carthage, Thebes, Sparta, Ephesus, Miletus, right? Like,
well, and according to Cicero, Theophrastus continued that research project, looking at and documenting all of the legal systems of all of those polities as well.
Yeah.
And we don't have any of that.
Right. Now, the best thing we do have is something called the Polis Inventory.
Okay.
Or no, I think it's called, the full title is an Inventory of Classical Greek Polis by two scholars named Hansen and Nielsen. It was a Danish team headed by those two guys, but they hired like a lot of starving grad students, and they collected all available information of all the polis in the Archaic and Classical period. So they have 1,100 something polis documented in this inventory.
Okay.
And for each one, they basically say everything we know about that polis, what form of government it had at what time, and so forth. Okay. The problem is it ends with the Classical period, and all those polis continued for another 300 years in the Hellenistic period. Okay, so it's like if I had like $10 million given to me as a grant, I would hire a bunch of starving grad students to do the second half of that study. Okay, like let's get the polis inventory down to the Roman Empire. Then we could actually do a statistical analysis and test out these theories much more carefully than we're able to right now.
Yeah, it would be similar to what went on in military science with these father and son team, the Dupuis, who in the 80s were very interested in applying statistical models to whatever data they could get their hands on to try to figure out, and a lot of their stuff got tapped by the US military for like force multipliers to figure out what actually worked for modern warfare and what didn't. And they were influenced by this guy Clausewitz, but they were like, yeah, we really have to do things differently to make sense of this. But they said in their studies, well, where are we going to get data sets? They didn't say, fortunately, we had World War II, but because it was a terrible catastrophe. But that's what supplied them with a lot of their stuff, and then Arab-Israeli wars and things along those lines. Yeah. So I mean, that's now. Actually, I did want to ask one question though about that project. So all of these political communities, they're not all Greek, right? Some are.
No, this inventory is only Greek. It would be great.
Is it? Okay.
It is. It would be great to also add the other ones, like the Phoenician, Etruscan, and Italic ones.
Yeah.
But the problem is
We don't have much
we
data,
don't have
right?
much data. We don't have much surviving texts from those places.
Yeah.
So
what else, since we're getting near to the end of our time, and you've been very generous with giving your time, what else do you think that like the ordinary person who's interested in intellectual and historical matters really, really needs to know about this concept of anacyclosis?
Well, I think the key difference between how the ancients viewed history and how we view history today, or how we're taught it today, is that the ancients believed that history is a treasure trove of useful data for your life.
Okay.
Aristotle said every type of political arrangement has already been tried. So if you have any idea, no matter how revolutionary it might appear to you, you can find it somewhere in the annals of history, and you can see how it turned out. When I first read that in college, I laughed at it. Now I kind of agree, but I don't want to get into that right now. I think it's Apollodorus, maybe in his Great History, or one of these ancient historians writes that history, and I think Cicero echoes this. History is like a treasure trove of examples. If you have any problem in your own life or in your community's life, open up some history and find a parallel, and you can find some guidance. Now, we're not taught that at all today. We are.
Well, do you think that some people are taught the wrong parallels? I mean, you see all these. If there's one go-to for Americans, it's like, we're in this stage of Roman history. Look at how Rome fell. We're going to fall like that. And you're like, well, I don't know that we're ancient Rome.
Well, the problem with that is that most people look at the fall of the Roman Empire,
right? Yeah,
and that's the obvious mistake, because we're not
You're not
the
looking
Roman
at the
Empire
decline
collapsing.
of the
We're
Republic,
the Roman
right?
Republic,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
might become an empire.
Yeah.
So, I think if people looked at the right Rome, that would be good. They look at the wrong Rome. But again, not there's no one parallel that gives you all the answers. Like in some respects, I think Athens is a better parallel to America. If you're looking at like NATO, the Athenian Delian League is the obvious parallel to NATO. If you're looking at demagoguery, Rome is better, because we have more speeches from demagogues that survive from Rome than we do from Athens, and we have a clearer view of that history.
Yeah.
But the point is, like, I think history is very useful, personally and civilizationally, but there is a barrier to entry. Like, you have to know quite a bit of history before it becomes useful, because if you have too few examples, you might start and you just try to force an analogy from what you know, you might go wrong. You need a very large awareness. But thanks to modern podcasts, I think if you just start listening to podcasts on history for after 2 years, which is a very small fraction of your life, you can acquire a huge database of historical examples, and I think that at that point you might start getting some real benefit from that.
That's a very interesting idea. The advantage of that is that you can do it whenever you want. Like if you're in transit, you could listen to it at night, as you're going to sleep. You could, you don't have anyone to eat with, listen to a podcast while you're having lunch, and you're gaining something that you're putting together in kind of a nexus, right? It's not just that you're gaining a bunch of little bits of information, you're getting to see a bigger picture over time. I mean, I would say the same goes for philosophy as well. There's a lot of people who read just a few philosophers and try to make everything fit their ideas, and you're like, well, maybe you also want to read this person, and this person, right? Although with history, seems like this might actually be a good question to ask. So somebody might say, well, crap, there's so much history out there. How can I possibly get a handle on it? Right? They could get a little pessimistic about that. What would you say to somebody like that?
Well, I would go by the person presenting the history. Okay.
Okay.
Like, so one thing I learned when I was in college, I always chose my courses based on the subject matter. Okay. Like, so someone was teaching, like, I would often have a dilemma. Okay. Like this course is exactly what I need for my degree, but this course is taught by this brilliant professor. Right.
Okay.
And I usually picked the subject, and I always
rather than the brilliant professor.
Unfortunately, yeah. I mean, I was under pressure to I started my classics.
I actually think that might be the right way to go.
Okay, well, let's just say if I could advise my younger self, I would say always pick the professor. Okay.
Okay.
Because you learn, like, I learned some of the best insights I learned about classics. I learned from a Russian literature professor who was teaching. He was teaching a required course. I went to Columbia, and one of the core curriculum courses was taught by this guy. And he happened to know Plato and Virgil inside out. He was like old school, like wealthy New York family where they really sent their kids to like the best academies. And he, you know, it was just a required course, and his main job was Russian literature, but he taught me more about Plato and Virgil than I learned from my classics professors, right? So like go by the person. Like if there's a podcaster who you find interesting who talks about Chinese history, but you don't care about that, you want to like, well, do that, you know, because you're going to learn more from the person who has insights to offer.
Yeah.
And then you'll move on to something else, you know, like, so it's that would be my advice.
Okay. Well, that's certainly a reasonable way to go about it. There is one other question I wanted to ask you before we run out of time altogether. So, and it's one that really suggests itself just at sort of a base level. What got you so interested in this key topic of anacyclosis in the first place? What's the origin story for you?
You're risking opening a can of worms now at the end. But, well, the origin story is I first encountered anacyclosis in graduate school when I read Polybius on my own time. I don't even remember why. I just was curious, and I read it, and I found this, and I thought, and I was struck by how similar it was to Plato's Republic, books 8 and 9.
Okay.
And I was like, this, because like I had been in classes where the professors would laugh at Plato for saying what he said.
Right.
But now I'm finding another great thinker from 200 years later who's saying the same thing. I was like, maybe could there be anything to this? At the same time, I was always taught that there's no real cycles in history, and I didn't really have any reason to doubt that. And I also grew up thinking that America was different than any society I read about in the books.
Okay.
It wasn't until, again, late in my graduate student career when I finally found a historical civilization that did remind me of America, and that was Rome and the late Republic. And the reason it took me so long to discover that was because no texts survive from that period. Everything we know about the Republic comes from the Empire, from authors writing in the Empire later. Okay, so like there's no text of a dialogue happening in 130 BC, like the way that we can read Plato and we can imagine ourselves on the ground in Athens walking the Agora, right? There's no text like that brings to life the Roman Republic. So it took me longer to find that. But when I did find that, I was like, wait, there's a lot of parallels here. And I did a quick Google search, like, has anybody made the connection between the late Roman Republic and today? And I found immediately the Anacyclosis Institute. And then that kind of just stuck in my mind. A couple of years later, when I got my PhD and I was exploring my options, I was looking for guests on my podcast. I reached out to the founder of the Institute, Tim Ferguson, and we had a phone call. We saw a lot of things in similar ways, and he invited me to work for him.
That's that's a lot of nice things aligning together. But I mean, that's so often that's how our paths work. Yeah. Well, let me thank you for coming on. Been looking forward to this for quite a while. And do you want to plug? We've mentioned the podcast. We'll include a link to it, but do you want to throw in all your plugs?
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Greg. It's been a great honor.
Welcome.
And the podcast is called Ancient Greece Declassified. It's on all the players, Apple, Spotify, etc. The website is greacepodcast.com, and the YouTube channel is under my moniker Lantern Jack. So that's all the info you need.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much.